The people who think they've won are often the least prepared for the truth. Ryan Mitchell stepped out of a black luxury sedan and adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit as the late afternoon sun reflected off the glass walls of the Grand Magnolia Ballroom. Beside him, Vanessa Collins slipped her hand through his arm and smiled at the crowd gathering near the entrance. Everything about the moment looked perfect. The flowers. The music drifting through the warm spring air. The guests turning to admire them. Ryan enjoyed every second of it. After all, this wedding wasn't just a celebration. To him, it was proof. Proof that he had moved on. Proof that he had upgraded. Proof that the chapter called Danielle Carter was finally over. Then he saw her. Seated quietly near the front of the ballroom. Alone. At least, that's what everyone assumed. Danielle wore a simple navy dress that seemed almost understated compared to the glittering outfits surrounding her. She wasn't trying to draw attention. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She simply sat there with calm posture, her hands resting lightly in her lap as if she had every right in the world to be there. Vanessa noticed her first. Her smile tightened. She actually came, she whispered. Ryan followed her gaze and felt a strange satisfaction settle into his chest. Danielle had accepted the invitation. Used as he expected. Around the room, whispers began spreading from table to table. Some guests recognized her immediately. Others only knew the story Ryan had spent years telling. The story of the ex-wife who couldn't keep up. The woman left behind while he built a better future. A few people glanced toward Danielle with curiosity. Others with pity. She seemed completely unaware of it all. Or maybe she simply didn't care. Ryan couldn't tell. He watched as a former colleague approached her table and asked something that made several nearby guests laugh softly. Danielle responded with nothing more than a polite smile. No argument. No defense. No bitterness. Used silence. Somehow that bothered him more than anger would have. Vanessa squeezed his arm. Come on, she said. Today is about us. Ryan nodded, but his eyes drifted back toward Danielle one more time. She looked different. Not richer. Not louder. Just different. Like someone carrying a secret she didn't need to share. Then, from somewhere outside the ballroom, the distant sound of arriving vehicles echoed through the entrance courtyard. Several guests turned toward the windows. The wedding planner suddenly froze. The valet staff straightened their posture. And for the very first time that afternoon, Danielle lifted her eyes toward the door and smiled. The sound outside faded almost as quickly as it had appeared, but the reaction it caused lingered inside the ballroom. Guests exchanged curious glances. A few people stood on their toes near the windows. Others pulled out their phones, hoping to see who had arrived. Ryan barely paid attention. His focus remained on Danielle. It bothered him that she looked so calm. 5 years earlier, calm was the last word anyone would have used to describe her life. Back then, Danielle Carter woke up before sunrise every morning. While most of the city still slept, she was already driving across town, balancing 2 jobs and stretching every dollar she earned. She believed in building a future with Ryan. She believed that sacrifice meant something. Their first apartment had been less than 700 square feet. The kitchen lights flickered. The air conditioner worked only when it felt like cooperating. But Danielle never complained. She framed Ryan's business plans and pinned them above their tiny desk. She spent weekends helping him prepare presentations. When his first company struggled, she sold jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother to help cover expenses. Ryan used to call her his good luck charm. At least when nobody else was listening. Then success arrived. Slowly at first. Then all at once. Better clients. Bigger contracts. Expensive restaurants. New circles of friends. People who only knew Ryan after he became successful. People who never saw the years Danielle spent helping him reach that point. Somewhere along the way, the language changed. Conversations became shorter. Dinners became business meetings. Premises became excuses. Eventually, Ryan stopped introducing Daniele as his partner. She became an afterthought, standing beside the version of himself he wanted the world to see. When the marriage ended, the story spread quickly. But it was not Danielle's story. It was Ryan's version of it. According to him, they simply grew apart. According to some friends, Danielle could not adapt to his success. According to others, she should have seen it coming. What nobody talked about were the years before the money. Nobody talked about the woman who stood beside him when success was nothing more than a dream written on legal pads scattered across a kitchen table. Daniele never corrected anyone. She never defended herself online. Never called old friends. Never explained what really happened. She simply disappeared from Ryan's world. And somehow, that silence allowed his version to become the truth. Now, years later, as whispers floated around the ballroom and guests watched her from across the room, many still believed the same story. Daniele noticed the looks. She noticed the assumptions. Yet she sat there with the same quiet composure. As if she knew something the rest of the room did not. And as the ballroom doors slowly began to open, that secret was finally getting closer. The massive ballroom doors moved only a few inches, yet the entire room seemed to lean toward them. Conversations slowed. Laughter faded. Even the string quartet near the stage appeared softer beneath the growing wave of curiosity. Ryan followed everyone's gaze, expecting perhaps a local politician, a celebrity, or one of the wealthy investors who occasionally attended events like this. Instead, the doors paused again. Whoever was arriving had not entered yet. The moment stretched. Then a guest near the entrance whispered something to another. Within seconds, the whisper spread across the room like a breeze moving through tall grass. Daniele remained seated. She did not turn around immediately. She did not rush to see who had arrived. She simply lowered her eyes to the folded wedding program in her hands. That small gesture caught Ryan's attention. Most people would have been curious. Most people would have looked. Daniele looked almost relieved. Across the ballroom, Vanessa noticed it too. "Why does she seem so comfortable?" she asked quietly. Ryan forced a smile. "Because she wants people to think she is doing better than she is." It sounded convincing enough when he said it out loud. Yet something about those words felt less certain than before. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Years ago, during one of the hardest months of their marriage, Ryan had come home frustrated after losing an important client. Daniele had listened without interrupting. When he finished, she simply poured him a cup of coffee and said, "You spend too much energy trying to control how people see you." At the time, he laughed it off. Looking back, he wondered why that sentence suddenly returned now. Near the entrance, several hotel staff members adjusted their jackets and stood straighter. One manager hurried across the lobby with an expression that looked equal parts nervous and excited. Guests began exchanging names. Gessis. Sieris. Nobody seemed certain. Yet the anticipation kept growing. Daniele finally lifted her head. For a brief second, her eyes moved toward the doors. A soft smile touched her face. Not the smile of someone hoping to impress a room. The smile of someone recognizing a familiar presence. Ryan felt a strange tension settle into his chest. It made no sense. Daniele was supposed to be a chapter he had closed years ago. She was supposed to be the person left behind while his life moved forward. Yet standing only 50 feet away, she seemed untouched by the judgment floating around the ballroom. Untouched by the whispers. Untouched by him. That realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Then another guest approached Danielle's table. An older woman Ryan recognized from his business network. The woman leaned down and spoke quietly. Daniele answered with a warm nod. The older woman smiled immediately and took the seat beside her as though she were greeting an old friend rather than a forgotten ex-wife. Ryan frowned. I knew that woman. She rarely spent time with anyone unless she considered them important. Before he could think further, the ballroom doors opened wider. Several heads turned at once. A few guests gasped softly. Whatever story Ryan believed he understood about Danielle Carter was beginning to crack. And within moments, the first piece of the truth was about to walk into the room. The doors finally opened completely, but instead of revealing a celebrity or a politician, they revealed something far more confusing. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped into the ballroom with the quiet confidence of someone who did not need attention to command a room. There was no dramatic entrance. No security team surrounding him. No announcement. Yet the effect was immediate. Several guests recognized him at once. Others looked around, trying to understand why people were suddenly whispering with renewed intensity. Ryan narrowed his eyes. The man looked familiar, but he could not immediately place him. Before he could think further, the hotel manager personally walked forward to greet the newcomer. That alone was unusual. Managers rarely left wedding operations during peak hours. Yet this one seemed eager to welcome him. The man shook his hand politely, exchanged a few words, and then glanced across the ballroom. His eyes settled on Danielle. The smallest smile appeared on his face. Daniele smiled back. Ryan felt something tighten in his chest. It was not jealousy. At least that was what he told himself. It was confusion. Because for the first time all afternoon, Danielle looked genuinely happy. Not polite. Not composed. Happy. The kind of smile that reached her eyes. Vanessa noticed it too. Do you know him? She asked. Ryan shook his head. No, but he kept watching. The man did not rush across the room. He greeted a few guests first. An elderly couple. A business owner near the entrance. A former city council member seated near the stage. Every interaction was brief, respectful, and surprisingly warm. People seemed pleased to see him. That only deepened Ryan's curiosity. Then another memory surfaced. A year after the divorce, Ryan had heard rumors that Danielle had moved 3 states away. Some said she opened a small coffee shop. Others claimed she had started over completely. Ryan never bothered verifying any of it. Why would he? In his mind, Daniele belonged to the past. The future was where his attention stayed. Yet while Ryan chased larger deals and bigger opportunities, Danielle had quietly disappeared from every conversation. Looking back now, he realized something strange. Nobody had ever brought her up again. Not because people forgot her. Because nobody knew anything about her. She had become invisible by choice. The man finally began walking through the ballroom. Conversations paused as he passed. Several guests nodded respectfully. Others stood to shake his hand. Ryan's eyes followed him the entire way. Then the man stopped beside Danielle's table. Daniele rose to her feet. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other with the effortless familiarity of two people who shared far more history than anyone else in the room understood. The man gently pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. Around the ballroom, whispers intensified. Ryan could no longer ignore the growing sense that he was missing something important. Across the room, an older businessman suddenly leaned toward his wife and quietly said a name. The wife's eyes widened instantly. Ryan could not hear the name itself. But judging by her reaction, whatever truth was hidden behind that man had just become far more significant than anyone expected. The name traveled through the ballroom in fragments. One whisper became 2. 2 became 10. Ryan watched the reactions before he heard the words themselves. That was what unsettled him most. People were not reacting the way they would for a celebrity. They were reacting with respect. The kind of respect usually reserved for someone whose decisions affected entire industries. Across the room, Danielle and the man continued talking quietly. Their conversation seemed effortless, untouched by the growing attention around them. He listened when she spoke. She laughed softly at something he said. There was no performance in it. No attempt to impress anyone. Used comfort. Familiarity. Trust. Raijan looked away first. Who is that? Vanessa asked. This time her voice carried genuine concern. Before Ryan could answer, a man from a nearby table leaned toward them. You do not know, he asked, sounding surprised. Raijan forced a polite smile. Should I? The man blinked. That is Alexander Sterling. The name landed heavily. Raijan felt his stomach tighten. Of course. Now he recognized him. Not from social events. From business magazines. Industry conferences. Financial reports. Alexander Sterling. Founder of Sterling Global Holdings. One of the most influential business leaders in the country. A man whose investments stretched across technology, transportation, real estate, and energy. A man worth more money than Ryan could realistically imagine. Vanessa's expression froze. That Alexander Sterling, she whispered. The businessman nodded. The only one. Silence settled between them. Raijan stared across the room again. His mind immediately searched for explanations. Maybe Alexander knew Danielle professionally. Maybe they sat on the same non-profit board. Maybe it was coincidence. Yet even as he considered those possibilities, another detail began bothering him. Alexander had not greeted Danielle the way people greet acquaintances. He had greeted her like someone important. Someone whose presence mattered more than anyone else's in the room. Suddenly Ryan remembered the invitation list. He had reviewed it months ago. Danielle's name was included. Alexander Sterling's was not. Which meant either the guest list had changed recently or Alexander was attending because of Danielle herself. The realization refused to leave him. Meanwhile, Danielle looked completely unaffected by the attention now surrounding her table. If anything, she seemed amused by it. Raijan found himself studying her more closely than he had all afternoon. There was confidence in the way she carried herself now. Not arrogance. Not superiority. Confidence. The quiet kind that comes from no longer needing validation from anyone. 5 years ago, after the divorce, Ryan expected Danielle to chase explanations. To defend herself. To prove something. Instead, she disappeared. Looking back, perhaps that should have been the first clue. People trying to rebuild their image usually make noise. Danielle had chosen silence. And now, watching one of the most powerful men in America sitting comfortably beside her, Ryan began wondering what happened during those missing years. What story had everyone missed while they were busy believing his version? Across the ballroom, Alexander glanced toward Danielle and gently reached for her hand. It was a simple gesture. Natural. Unforced. Yet the effect was immediate. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. Because suddenly the question was no longer whether they knew each other. The question was how close they really were. And within minutes, the answer was about to leave the entire room speechless. The ballroom felt different now. Not louder. Quieter. As if hundreds of people were suddenly paying attention to details they had ignored before. The wedding planner continued moving between tables, the musicians continued playing, and servers continued carrying trays across the room. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. Raijan could feel it. For years, he had been the person people watched. The successful businessman. The man with the impressive career, the growing network, and the carefully crafted image. Tonight was supposed to reinforce that image. Instead, attention kept drifting somewhere else. It kept drifting toward Danielle. Toward the woman everyone thought they understood. Toward the story nobody had questioned until now. Across the ballroom, Alexander and Danielle sat side by side. They were not trying to become the center of attention. That was the strange part. If anything, they seemed completely comfortable staying in the background. Yet guests kept approaching their table. Some stopped briefly to greet Alexander. Others lingered longer, speaking to Danielle with surprising warmth. Raijan noticed several people who had barely acknowledged her earlier now smiling as they spoke with her. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Vanessa shifted uneasily beside him. Why would she never mention any of this, she asked. Raijan did not answer. Because the question had already crossed his own mind. If Danielle truly knew someone like Alexander Sterling, why had she hidden it? Why had she never posted photographs online? Why had she never corrected the rumors? Why had she allowed people to believe she was struggling? The answer arrived unexpectedly. Because she had never been trying to prove anything. That realization unsettled him more than any public confrontation could have. Raijan suddenly remembered the last argument they ever had before the divorce. He had accused Danielle of lacking ambition. He had told her that success was about visibility. About influence. About making people notice you. Daniele listened quietly and then said something he dismissed at the time. People who know their value do not spend all day advertising it. At the time, he thought she was making excuses. Standing here now, watching the room slowly orbit around her presence, he wondered whether she had understood something he never did. Near the stage, the master of ceremonies began preparing for the formal introductions. Guests returned to their seats. Conversation softened. The wedding program was moving forward. Yet Ryan's attention remained fixed on Danielle's table. Alexander stood first. Then he offered his hand. Daniele accepted it naturally. Not like someone greeting a powerful stranger. Like someone who belonged beside him. Together they walked toward the front of the ballroom. Heads turned immediately. A few guests exchanged stunned glances. Others smiled knowingly. Raijan felt his pulse quicken. He still did not understand the full story, but he knew one thing with certainty. The room was preparing to witness something important. Then, as Alexander and Danielle reached the front row, the officiant glanced toward them and smiled. Not politely. Not professionally. Personally. As if greeting people he already knew very well. And in that moment, Ryan realized the surprise waiting for him was far bigger than a chance encounter between his ex-wife and a billionaire. The officiant adjusted the microphone and welcomed everyone to the celebration. Guests settled into their seats, but the energy in the room remained divided. Officially, the focus was supposed to be on Ryan and Vanessa. Unofficially, half the ballroom was still trying to understand the connection between Danielle Carter and Alexander Sterling. Raijan sat rigidly in his chair. The closer the ceremony came to beginning, the more distracted he became. He hated distractions. Especially ones he could not control. Across the aisle, Danielle appeared completely at ease. Alexander sat beside her, occasionally leaning over to exchange a quiet comment that made her smile. Every movement between them seemed natural. Nothing looked staged. Nothing looked calculated. That bothered Ryan more than if it had. He had spent years convincing himself that Danielle would eventually regret losing him. Yet the woman sitting a few rows away did not look like someone carrying regret. She looked like someone who had found peace. The officiant began sharing stories about Ryan and Vanessa's relationship. Guests smiled politely. Cameras flashed. Laughter appeared at the expected moments. Then something unexpected happened. Vanessa's father, Charles Collins, rose from his seat near the front. Charles was a respected businessman known throughout the region. His family owned several commercial developments and maintained connections with some of the most influential executives in the state. When he stood, many guests assumed he was preparing to give a short welcome speech. Instead, Charles turned toward the audience. His eyes landed directly on Alexander. A smile crossed his face. Before we continue, he said into the microphone, I would like to acknowledge a guest I was not expecting to see tonight. Instantly, the room grew quieter. Rajan's stomach tightened. Charles stepped away from the stage and walked toward Alexander's table. "Alexander," he said warmly, extending his hand. "It has been too long." Alexander stood and returned the handshake. The interaction was friendly. Familiar. Genuine. Murmurs spread across the ballroom. Charles laughed softly. "You know, half the projects my company completed in the last 3 years would never have happened without your support." More whispers. More surprised faces. Rajan felt heat rising behind his collar. Charles continued speaking. "And I still remember your advice during one of the toughest years our company ever faced." Several guests exchanged stunned glances. It was one thing to know Alexander Sterling was wealthy. It was another thing entirely to see respected business leaders treating him like a mentor. Charles then turned toward Danielle. "And it is wonderful seeing you again as well." Danielle smiled politely. "Thank you, Charles. That single exchange changed everything. Because it revealed something nobody expected. Danielle was not meeting these people for the first time. She already knew them. Not as an outsider. Not as someone's guest. As someone who belonged in their world." Ryan's confidence began slipping away piece by piece. Every assumption he carried into this ballroom was collapsing. Yet the biggest surprise had not arrived yet. Because while everyone was busy processing Alexander's influence, almost nobody noticed the expression on Charles Collins's face when he looked at Danielle. It was not the expression of a man greeting an acquaintance. It was the expression of someone greeting family. And within minutes, that detail was about to change everything. Charles returned to his seat, but the atmosphere he left behind remained. Guests were no longer paying attention to the wedding schedule. They were watching Danielle and Alexander. Watching the pieces of a story slowly come together. Ryan tried to focus on the ceremony, but his thoughts kept circling the same question. How had Danielle gone from being the woman everyone pitied after the divorce to someone who seemed connected to people at the very top of the business world? The answer felt just out of reach. Then it arrived from an unexpected direction. One of Ryan's business partners leaned over from the next table. His expression looked almost uncomfortable. "Ryan," he said quietly, "there is something you probably should know." Ryan forced a smile. "What is that?" The man hesitated before speaking. "The sterling contract your company signed last quarter." Ryan immediately recognized what he meant. It was the largest opportunity his firm had ever secured. A multi-year agreement that could transform the future of his business. Ryan had spent months celebrating that deal. "What about it?" he asked. The partner glanced toward Alexander. The final approval came directly from him. Ryan felt his stomach drop. "What are you talking about?" "Alexander Sterling owns the parent company." The words landed like a stone. Ryan stared across the ballroom. Suddenly every detail from the past few months returned with painful clarity. The delayed negotiations. The final executive review. The approval letter signed at the highest level. At the time, he had viewed those events as distant corporate procedures. Now they felt very different. Because the man who ultimately controlled the future of Ryan's largest contract was sitting beside Danielle. Not across the country. Not hidden inside some corporate headquarters. Sitting 20 feet away. Vanessa's father, Charles, unknowingly added even more weight to the moment. Speaking with another guest nearby, he laughed and said, "Alexander has built one of the most influential companies in America. Thousands of businesses depend on decisions made by his leadership team." Several people nodded in agreement. Ryan heard every word. His confidence was disappearing faster than he could hide it. Yet the biggest revelation still remained. As guests settled back into their seats, an older woman approached Danielle and Alexander. She smiled warmly and asked a simple question. "How long have you two been married now?" The conversation around them stopped. Danielle looked at Alexander. Alexander smiled. Almost 3 years. Silence swept across the ballroom. Several guests literally froze. Raijan could not move. Married. Not dating. Not engaged. Married. Suddenly everything made sense. The familiarity. The quiet confidence. The complete absence of explanation. Daniele had never corrected anyone because she had nothing to prove. While people spent years discussing her past, she had quietly built an entirely new life. And now every person in the room was realizing the same thing at exactly the same moment. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The music continued softly in the background, but it felt distant now. The entire ballroom seemed suspended between surprise and disbelief. Raijan stared at Danielle as if he were seeing her for the first time. Not because she had changed into someone else. Because he finally realized how little he had known about the woman she became after she walked away. 3 years. She had been married for 3 years. While people repeated old stories about her. While former friends assumed she was struggling. While Ryan convinced himself that she was still trapped somewhere in the shadow of their past. Daniele had quietly built a life that required no explanation. A life she never advertised. A life she never used to prove anyone wrong. Across the room, Alexander stood and adjusted his jacket. Daniele rose beside him. The ceremony was preparing to move into its next stage, and they intended to leave before the reception began. They had come. They had shown respect. They had celebrated the occasion. Nothing more. Nothing less. As they prepared to walk toward the exit, several guests approached to say goodbye. Some shook Alexander's hand. Others hugged Danielle warmly. The reaction spoke louder than words ever could. These people did not see her as someone's former wife. They saw her as herself. Raijan watched every moment. A year earlier, he would have expected satisfaction from seeing Danielle attend this event. He imagined she would look at his success and wonder what might have been. Instead, he found himself confronting a different truth. Daniele had never been trying to compete with him. She had been building something entirely separate. Something stronger. Something that did not depend on public approval. Near the entrance, Danielle paused briefly. For the first time all evening, her eyes met Ryan's. No anger. No bitterness. No triumph. Used calm recognition. The kind shared between two people who once knew each other well and then followed different roads. Raijan waited for a remark. A smile. Some sign that she understood the irony of the moment. None came. Daniele simply nodded politely. Then she turned away. Alexander offered his arm. She accepted it. Together they walked through the ballroom doors and disappeared into the evening light beyond the glass. The room remained silent for another moment after they left. Raijan looked down at his hands and finally understood what nobody else needed to explain. Daniele had not won because she married a billionaire. She had not won because people admired her. She had won years earlier, the moment she stopped measuring her worth through someone else's eyes. And as the door slowly closed behind her, the only thing left in the ballroom was a lesson no one there would ever forget. She did not win him back. She won herself.